Okay, welcome to lectures 3 and 4, and I'm combining these. And as you have noticed, I am going to use QuickTime Player from now on, and we'll see if that works a little bit better than the Blackboard room that we did previously. Okay. All right, now we're getting it here. Okay, so we're going to talk about advertising parables from the 1920s and 30s, and this directly corresponds with your next writing assignment. Well, you will be asked to analyze advertising parables, and this discussion will hopefully be really helpful in guiding you through that next writing assignment. So some of the questions we're going to go over today: what are the larger social, political, and economic changes in the 1920s? What are the advertising parables of the 1920s? What are the larger social, political, and economic shifts during the Great Depression? And how did the parables change in the 1930s? And what are the new parables in the 1930s as well? So there's a lot going on in the United States during the 1920s. And where we left off in lecture 2, we had talked about when advertising really becomes more sophisticated at the turn of the century and the Industrial Revolution, and the industry becomes even more sophisticated during the 1920s. At the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, the United States was converting from a wartime economy from World War I to a peacetime economy. When weapons for World War I were no longer needed, there was a temporary stall in the economy. After the few years, things bounced back. And after several decades of urbanization and industrialization, post World War I America was really defined by a rapid increase in the availability of mass produced merchandise and mass produced goods. And of course, advertising is really key to this. Business leaders had a renewed sense of confidence. People sort of thought of everyone's guided by this kind of mob mentality. Everyone is guided by their unconscious desires and emotions. And this was fueled by new trends in pop psychology. Freud was very popular during the 1920s, and this ideology fed into advertising messages as well. It was also during this period that science and health really came into their own during the 1920s. So medicine and health advanced remarkably. Albert Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921. Diphtheria, which was a really horrible childhood disease where a lot of kids, at the turn of the century, about half of kids died before they reached age 5. And this dramatically changes where people are living longer and people are really understanding vaccines, modern medicine a lot better. People understand nutrition, caloric consumption, and physical vitality. And dietary habits of Americans as a whole really changes in response to this, where people are eating less fat and more meat and more fruits and vegetables as people realize vitamins and their effects and all of the diseases and horrible things that had come from malnutrition at the turn of the century. Another thing is worth mentioning, and this is sort of going back to point number 2, is that it seemed as if the stock market was just going to never quit increasing. Stock speculation went sky high. Gross national product was at a rapid increase during this period. And so this is a period in which, again, businesses see no end in sight, and they're very, very confident. Another thing worth mentioning is the feminist movement. And so this is the first wave of the feminist movement in the United States. It's very important. This is the suffrage movement, where, of course, women get the right to vote, and women's fashion changes dramatically, where if you look at women and what they're wearing and what they're doing at the turn of the century, where we left off from the last lecture, is very, very different from what women are doing in the 1920s. They're cutting off their hair, they're smoking cigarettes, they're wearing a little tiny dress called the flapper, so they're shedding all of the Victorian lace and the kind of conservative dress that they wear. And this is important too to the advertising industry, because they're kind of weaving feminist messages and styles during the 1920s into ads. And one of the important styles of the 1920s, which I think is really quite beautiful, is an Art Deco style. And this is a really a new style. And this is a kind of, style of ads that you see, people will sort of clip these and hang them around in their kitchens. As you can see, the layouts are asymmetrical. There's really these kind of clean lines and sans serif typefaces. And you'll see this in ads in the 1920s. So, as I had discussed before, pop psychology and psychology are really important in the 1920s. And the advertising industry is very interested in this because, of course, the ad industry is interested in sort of what makes people tick and what motivates people to buy products. A key figure here is a man named John B. Watson, and he's a behavioral psychologist. And so he doesn't counsel people in his office, about their various problems, but he studies people's behavior. And he has one of the early PhDs in psychology. J. Walter Thompson hires him, and he's really credited for having grounding advertising strategies in a number of psychological studies. He develops tests and experiments to sort of see, what makes people, what motivates people to buy certain kinds of products. And he's really credited for the use of something called dramatic testimonials in advertisements. And we see this all the time today. And so that's, for example, in a commercial, if you will see someone, give a testimony about how they've used the product and about how this product has really changed their life and improved their life in a number of ways. And again, we see this in ads all the time. And John B. Watson is the one that sort of comes up with this through his experiments that he does. So one of the things that's new in the 1920s is these ads about personal hygiene. And during the Victorian period and during earlier periods, it was sort of considered rude to discuss personal hygiene, to have discussions about the body. And during the 1920s, advertisers are more willing to do this to sell a whole host of new consumer products. Convincing women to buy personal hygiene products is used with these dramatic testimonials. And some of these testimonials are sort of focused on external judgments. So what will people think of you if you don't use a certain kind of product? And so if you can see in this ad here, this is, a frank discussion about the subject too often avoided. And if you can read the copy here, this is about within the curve of a woman's arm. And so, of course, this is about wearing deodorant and how it's really important to wear deodorant. And if you don't wear deodorant, the consequences are that someone will judge you. And in this case, the story here, the testimonial here, is about this woman being judged by this man here for not wearing deodorant. And people weren't, really prior to the 1920s, there wasn't too much of a concern about body odor. It is sort of a construction that comes from the advertising industry, the deodorant industry, and there are other sort of, personal hygiene things that become an issue through advertising as well. So one of the new products during the 1920s is feminine hygiene products. And one of the things that advertisers had to deal with is, well, how do we get women to buy these products? They're embarrassed to buy them. They don't want to go to the store and buy them. And so the advertisements would tell people, well, go into your drugstore and the druggist will put the Kotex in a brown paper bag and it comes with instructions and you will never have to be embarrassed about buying this product again. And interestingly, Kotex was actually, this kind of cotton was developed through the war to help men who were bleeding. And so the ads would kind of tell the story of Kotex, where Kotex came from. And again, this was a way to sort of make women feel comfortable buying this very new product in the 1920s. Again, as I stated, there is a sort of focus on external judgments. And so if you don't use, I'll back up for a second. If you don't use a certain product, you will be judged by your peers. And that was really for a whole host of products from, cars to shoes to, of course, deodorants and personal hygiene products. But as you can see in this ad here, it also applies to toilet paper. And so if you read the copy here, this is a testimonial about, well, if you don't have the right kind of toilet paper, if you don't use this particular brand, you will be judged by your peers. And you can see here, I like this one because you can see it's very Art Deco, and the women are dressed like they dressed in the 1920s. So another important trend during the 1920s is something called the ensemble. And of course, Marchand discusses this in his article. And the ensemble means fashion as a way to enhance a product's value and increase its price. And the ensemble is a way to sort of get people to buy more than what they needed. So if you redo, for example, your bathroom and you put in a new sink, you've just got to redo the whole thing so it fits together in a whole ensemble. But prior to the 1920s, people sort of bought what they needed. So I would buy a refrigerator and I would use that refrigerator until it breaks down and I no longer need it. During the 1920s, this really changes, where people are told to buy things not based on need, but based on something different. The ensemble, meaning it's not about a product's use, but it's sort of about fashion and the way things look. And so you can see here, really again, prior to the 1920s, you would have one pair of shoes, maybe one for winter or one for summer, and you would wear that shoe until you could no longer wear it. You'd probably get it repaired a few times. This changes in the 1920s, where women are told, well, you need a different kind of shoe for each and every outfit. And fashions after the 1920s really start to change dramatically. And we see this all the time today, right? Where if you have, go through your closet and you get rid of things that are perfectly useful, but you might feel that, okay, well, they're a little bit out of fashion. This year, chunky heels are in or pointy toes are in. And the reason why this occurs, right, is because products are designed to become obsolete, meaning that they're designed so that they don't last forever and that you need to keep consuming. And we can thank the ad industry for this. And here's a car. Of course, advertisers and manufacturers start to dabble with changing cars and changing the color. This is a bathroom, and so what colors would you use? With plumbing fixtures of mean green. And so some of the ads during the 20s are instructional, and they're telling people, well, how do you put together this ensemble in your home? And even colored toothbrushes. How your toothbrush looks has a lot to do with the looks of your teeth and camera cases as well. And so people buy cameras. You can buy your camera and your camera case in 5 attractive colors. And so again, color is sort of key to the ensemble. And one of the things that occurs alongside this is that there's new technologies in advertising and in magazines, so that printers can use all kinds of different colors to make these ensembles sort of come to life through advertising. So now I'll go over the parables from the 1920s. And again, this corresponds directly with Marchand's chapter that you read, the first chapter. And the first one is the democracy of goods and the democracy of afflictions. And so this basically meant that you could have the same kinds of consumer products as someone who is very rich and famous. In this case, you can have, if you look here on the left, you can have the same kind of product as royalty. Another part of this is afflictions. And so even Hollywood movie stars struggle with the same kinds of problems. And so if you buy Lux soap, you can use the same kind of soap as Mae West. And this is, of course, used in advertising all the time today. And we can see this from all kinds of testimonials from, the rich and famous. So the parable of the first impression is used quite frequently during the 1920s and again in the 1930s as well, and we'll talk about this. And this is basically those kinds of external judgments telling people you have to make a good first impression. And the way to make a great first impression is to use a certain type of consumer product. If you don't use that product, you might offend someone and you might make a negative first impression, which can affect your relationship with that person, which can prevent you from getting a job. And so these ads really play on people's fears and deep fears of what happens in social settings when you don't fit in. And again, what advertising told people, the way to fit in is to buy certain consumer products. And so in this case, and in this ad, have you ever tried selling yourself to you? You can make a favorable first impression by buying this brand of toothbrush. And in this case, in the other ad, there are two women and they're gossiping. And they're talking about how they're at a party and the person doesn't have the right kind of silver. And so if you want to make a great first impression, you better get, the right kind of flatware. Another parable that Marchand discusses is something called civilization redeemed. And we see this in advertising all the time. And so during the 1920s, and really in the matter of 20 years, right? So if you look at the turn of the century to the 1920s, most people, again, householded, they made their own consumer goods, they knew where their goods came from. In the 1920s, so many things were made in factories and were mass produced. And then there were a lot of people, as you can imagine, that are sort of uncomfortable with this. Civilization Redeemed made people feel more comfortable. And it talked about how these consumer goods were natural, were from the earth, were made with all natural ingredients to make people feel, again, more comfortable consuming these, highly, in some cases, highly processed goods that are made in factories. And we still see this all the time in advertising today, perhaps more so than ever, where companies, want to tell us how their products are all natural, from the earth. If you watch, television commercials for juice, I mean, even if you see an ad campaign for fast food like McDonald's, they want to tell us how their food is really all natural. Another parable is called The Captivated Child. So childhood becomes really important in the 1920s. At the turn of the century, sort of people had kids, and the purpose of having kids was like those kids would go out and work on the farm. And so children were very much thought of as laborers in the household. And it wasn't as if they weren't loved, but things really changed in the 1920s, where children are considered to be very precious, members of the family that parents need to protect. And they're not really thought of anymore as laborers for the family. And so you have a whole host of ads telling parents how, certain kinds of consumer products represent a better kind of parenting. And these, provoked guilt or feelings of inadequacy in parents, and of course help sell these products like canned, ready to serve vegetables. And this is an ad telling, you can see all the copy here telling the parent how this certain brand of strained vegetables provided a certain kind of nutritional need. And this one here for beech nut macaroni and spaghetti really does the same. So some of the conclusions from the 1920s, as you could see, there's a lot more emphasis on the art than the product itself. Another trend is designing obsolescence, meaning that, products are actually designed to become obsolete. And this happens through the ensemble. This happens really through fashion and style. And the changing fashion and style helps sell products. So, maybe my bathroom is fine. It still works. I have a sink, and a toilet, but I want that new main grain. And so I'm going to, redo the whole thing. The other conclusion from the 1920s is that these emotional techniques really motivate. And we learned this, people learned this in World War I through all of those fear-based approaches. And if you watch the second lecture, I showed you some of those. And you also, saw some World War I propaganda in the video you watched. And this happens even more in the 1930s. And so emotional techniques, meaning tapping into people's fears, tapping into people's anxieties about first impressions, about getting a job, about finding a romantic partner. And again, these are still used in the 1930s, and they're still really used today to sell products. And you can think of, usually the ones that students bring up in a lecture is ads for Axe, and the whole host of, Axe products tap into sort of men's fears and desires to attract women. Okay, so the next chapter that you read in Marchand, I believe is chapter 9, talks about advertising during the Great Depression, and the ways in which advertising really changes during the Great Depression. So, some of the political and economic shifts during the Great Depression. One is the prosperity of the 1930s really comes to a screeching halt. Um, Between 1929 and 1931, the gross national product is actually cut in half. This is unprecedented in American history. More than 10,000 American businesses failed. The value of goods falls by 2/3. Banks fail along with people's life savings. I mean, again, this is unprecedented, and nothing like this has happened since. I mean, even the recession in 2008 doesn't even compare to what happened during the 1930s, and it really stands in such stark contrast to what happens during the 1920s, where there is seemingly unlimited economic growth. 25% of the workforce is unemployed. And this image here, this is a famous image that you can see, and this is an image of people standing in bread lines. So people were literally starving to death, homeless on the streets. And so this was a very, very dark time in American history. And so, in particular, for the advertising industry, the Great Depression presented a particular challenge. One of the first things that happens during a recession is that companies will cut their advertising. It seems like something that's unnecessary. So they cut advertising during the 1930s, and a lot of advertising people who were gainfully employed in the 1920s were laid off in the 1930s. Agencies were forced to shut down, and so this was also a pretty dark time if you were in the ad industry. So, those advertising tactics playing on fear about external judgments and anxieties and vulnerabilities about people judging us are intensified in the 1930s. Clients come to the advertising agencies and they say, we need to sell products, we're hurting. And so advertisers really take new liberties, again, in tapping into people's fears and desires about external judgments. So this one here, and sorry, this is a little bit blurry, but does your husband look younger than you do? And you can see, a picture says 1,000 words. And if you look at this, you can see what's going on. Her husband is clearly, in the arms of another woman. Why is he in the arms of another woman? Well, this woman, is looking a little bit old. What's the solution to that? To dye her hair. And this is so common today. I mean, we're so used to seeing these kinds of tropes in advertising today. And, perhaps they're a little bit more subtle, but there are a number of, ad campaigns that tell women that they are inadequate if they don't look young. And there's a lot of pressure, for women to look younger. So take a minute and look at this ad here. And there's a lot going on here. Okay, and so the headline says, come on, please, let's go this once. Well, the product is for Lysol. And then if you read the copy, I know it's a little bit difficult to read. It says, but no, she's too tired as usual. It's little episodes like this that wreck marriages. And this woman here, she's failing to stay young for her husband, and she has only herself to blame. Again, what's going on here? And if you keep reading it, it's about feminine hygiene. And it's telling women, well, in order to stay young for their husband, they need to use Lysol. Again, it's really confusing. And I've asked students before in a lecture, well, what's going on here? And they'll say, well, maybe they want women to wash with Lysol in some way. But obviously this ad is about sex, right? It's about, come on, please, let's go this one. So he's talking about sex, and this is about Lysol. And actually, again, some of this is a little bit unclear, but this is actually an ad telling women that they need to use Lysol as a vaginal douche, as a disinfectant. And Lysol was sold not only as a vaginal douche, but also as a birth control method. And of course, if you've ever used Lysol, you know that it is a pretty harsh cleaning product. It didn't belong anywhere near, women's bodies. And so this was very deceptive. It, of course, didn't work as a birth control. But again, companies are really taking new liberties to try to sell these consumer products. And so you could write in and actually get a pamphlet, and the pamphlet would tell you exactly how to use Lysol as a method of birth control. Okay, so this one, this line in this headline, she are always a bridesmaid but never a bride, actually comes from the company Listerine. Again, of course, tapping into women's fears that they'll be old maids, they're never going to find a husband. And why did this poor woman in this ad named Millie? Why was she not able to get a husband? Well, she had unpleasant breath, a condition made up by the advertising industry called halitosis. Of course, the solution to that, so if you really want to, wrangle a man and get married, and if you don't want to be an old maid, you just need to gargle with some Listerine. Make it agreeable. Again, this one here, often a bridesmaid, but never a bride. Poor Edna. She's really pathetic. And her birthdays are creeping gradually toward that tragic 30 mark. After you're 30 as a woman, if you're unmarried, it's all over. You might as well throw in the towel. But if you want to prevent, yourself from being an old maid, you should use Listerine. And so again, a lot of these ads tapped into women's anxieties about aging, and really told women that the way that they could have value was to find a husband. And so some of these, strategies, don't paint the advertising industry in a very positive light. Okay. There were a number of visual cliches that were used during the 1930s, and Marchand discusses these in his chapter. And so one of them, the visual cliches, is called visual drama. And so these really side-by-side comparisons of ads. And this was something considered taboo in the 1920s. Companies rarely did this. They didn't attack another brand or another product. Well, during the 1930s, competition intensifies, and advertisers are more willing to do this in the 1930s. Another one of those visual cliches are really cluttered layouts. So, advertisers, of course, are paying for that particular magazine ad and the space in the magazine. And so they want to pack in as much information as possible. They're more willing to listen to agencies and to use more, art and less copy. Well, during the 1930s, that's all changes. So this isn't a very, attractive time for advertising. People are unlikely to put ads like this, up on their wall as decorations. Another one of those visual cliches are sunbeams. And so one of the ways in which advertisers made people feel more comfortable in buying consumer products was to tell people that there would be a bright future ahead. And the way that they represented this visually was through sunbeams, with people, looking out onto the horizon at better times ahead. Here's another one with sunbeams, off in the horizon, and another one as well. Another visual cliche that you will see quite frequently in ads from the 1930s is the clench fist. Rather than portray consumers as impoverished or unemployed, people were portrayed as tough, right? So clench your fist, get past it, you'll be hardworking. The clenched fist is used in this one to represent sort of, people like clenching their fist as hoarding money. And this is actually an ad for an ad agency telling people, listen, you have to spend some money to make some money. So you have to spend a little bit of money on advertising. So one of the technologies worth mentioning, new media technologies during the 1930s, is radio. Of course, radio is developed during World War I. Radio is developed for ship-to-ship communication for the Navy, but it doesn't really become widely available, and it doesn't become commercialized, meaning it doesn't begin to supply advertising until the 1930s. And radio really brings a new kind of advertising into the American home. If you look at a print ad, or if you open up a magazine or newspaper, you can just flip past that ad. You don't have to read it. But if you're listening to the radio and an ad comes on, it sort of was thought of as, invading the home. And, advertisers in general are using more hard sell techniques, telling people, playing on their anxieties, telling them they need certain consumer products. And so people don't like radio advertising very much. One of the things that radio programmers begin to do is they use a lot of product placement in their programming. And the soap opera begins during the 1930s. And if you listen to a soap opera from the 1930s, it's just completely full of product placement. It's highly irritating. And so every single story, almost every story is about, selling some kind of consumer product. Okay, so the parables. So that last question that I raised in the beginning is, what are the parables during the 1930s, or how did the parables change, and what are some of the new parables from the 1930s? The most obvious one really is appeal to the economy. And of course, this, appeal to the economy was a return to an obvious emphasis on price. There had really been a long-standing taboo against mentioning price in an ad, and this was lifted. Many brand names like Listerine, for example, avoided mentioning price altogether. It was considered to be, sort of rude. Advertising was above mentioning price. Well, not at all in the 1930s. So this one here for toilet paper, you can compare that to the toilet paper ad that I showed you from the 1930s. That was very artful. That was the, conversation between two women. It was more subtle. This is a very hard sell technique. This is a not very pretty ad. There's a lot of information packed in here. Again, this one here, a very cluttered layout. All of the ads here really are emphasizing price. There's more competition during the 1930s. People don't have as much money. And so advertisers, again, are more willing to mention price. The other parable from the 1920s that really carries over to the 1930s is that parable of the first impression. And again, that parable of the first impression is really intensified during the 1930s. And so this one is not subtle at all. There's no long story here. It's simply, halitosis makes you unpopular, right? Don't fool yourself. And again, it's that same story here where, this woman's man, is in the arms of another woman because she has halitosis, which was a word, again, invented by the advertising industry to sell Listerine. Here's another one for Listerine. How's your breath today? Again, tapping into people's fears. And another one, he wonders why she said no. Well, the reason she said no is his socks were sagging, right? Because every woman, wants a man who has adequate socks. It's very important. Okay, so the democracy of goods used as well during the 1930s as it was used in the 1920s. This one here is very direct, and this is an ad for AT&T. And I think this one is interesting because if you look at the image here, and if you look at the, specifically in the people in the image here, you can see that there's all types of people represented, a wealthy person, a chimney sweep, looks like a domestic worker. And so, advertising really wanted to tell people, well, you might be from the working class or you might be struggling. But in this, time and place, really everybody is struggling. And in this one here, one of the things that connects all of us that we all share is the bell system, the telephone system. This ad here, right? Well, you might not be rich and famous. You might not be a Hollywood star, but if you have the same vacuum cleaner, you have a little sort of piece of that life. So the unraised hand and skinny kid, and this is a new parable. These are two new parables that Marchand discussed. And this is sort of similar to that parable of the captivated child, but it really shifts in the 1930s. And it played on people's fears of malnutrition. Again, this is a time period where people are tightening their belts, where people are having a hard time feeding their families. And, being skinny as a kid was something that represented and constituted great shame during this period. It's sort of the opposite of today, right? Where all we hear about is childhood obesity. Having, a thin child isn't something that, anyone would be ashamed about. But this was a sign in the 1930s. It was actually a sign of poverty. And again, things have sort of flip-flopped. And this one here was, this, kid won't drink. And so it's going to affect his classroom performance. The way to get him to really pack in the calories is this chocolate flavored beverage. This one here about, how they get poor Dorothy to gain 9 pounds through, again, this vitamin beverage. The mother, at the top, she winced when they called her skinny. Now she's doing really, really great. And this one here, very, very similar. Poor Sally, she's very thin. She's not eating. Her classmates are laughing about her grades. There's a lot more emphasis on how proper nutrition will lead to a better school performance. And so this one here, again, playing on, people's sort of anxieties and fears. How do you, give your child adequate nutrition? Well, you feed them, breakfast cereal. Breakfast cereal as a way to, give your kids more caloric intake really starts during the 1920s and 30s. And then there's a backlash to this kind of later, during the 1970s and 80s where people are saying, well, maybe those breakfast cereals aren't that great for kids in the morning. So, as you could see from, all the ads that I showed you from the 30s is advertising is really pretty irritating in the 1930s. It's not very pretty. It's tapping into people's, deep-seated fears and anxieties. And so this magazine started in the 1930s called Ballyhoo Magazine. It was one of the top-selling magazines in the 30s, even though people, were buying fewer magazines, buying fewer consumer products. This one remained to be really popular. And this magazine was simply all about making fun of advertising and the advertising industry. And so these were just, funny ads. They were supposed to make people laugh, but they were really poking fun at existing ad campaigns. This one here, Smile into Prosperity, wear a smileette. Sort of making fun of those ad campaigns that told people, well, everything is going to be okay. This one here, Prosperity Bound. And this is, obviously a homeless man. This one's kind of funny. This is making fun of, AT&T ads, telling people to buy telephones. And they're like, ha ha, you should have a telephone in every single room in your home. Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Of course, now we're completely glued to our phones. Again, making fun of some of those dieting ad campaigns. Talking about, women's unpaid labor, women in the home and their sort of unpaid labor. And so people were really dissatisfied with advertising. They were dissatisfied specifically with the deception on part of the advertising industry. They were not happy with the fact that advertisers weren't supplying them with information about products, that advertisers were exploiting their fears and desires. And so there was a consumer movement during the 1930s that formed based on these critiques of the advertising industry. And they actually eventually were so powerful that they forced the US government and the federal government to pass the first piece of legislation called the Wheeler-Lee Amendment in 1938. And this is the first piece of federal legislation that regulates the ad industry. It required the FTC, which is called the Federal Trade Commission, to regulate advertising. This is still around today, so the Wheeler-Lee Amendment is still in place. And what it said is that advertisers couldn't explicitly lie and can't explicitly mislead consumers. Okay, so you can no longer tell people, hey, Lysol is a great birth control, for example. One of the things that's interesting here is the result of this is that it actually bolsters the ad industry's use of kind of ambiguous and emotional appeals. So for example, if you are Listerine, you might not have an ad that spells out exactly scientifically how Listerine cures bad breath because you might be accused of lying, or maybe an ad one of the things that Listerine used to say, it no longer says, is that Listerine actually helps fight the flu or cold. So you might not explicitly make that false scientific claim, but you're going to use more ambiguity, more images, maybe more testimonials from the rich and famous. And so it actually means that advertisers end up supplying even less information to consumers. And most, ads that you can think of today, with the exception of maybe a few, pharmaceutical ads or medicine ads, they don't really supply us, with a whole lot of information. And so if you want to get, information about a car or a product, you rarely will look to advertising as to how to get, that information. So I want to thank you for listening to lecture number 3. I hope that this helps you with your next paper, and I hope that, recording these lectures on QuickTime will be a little bit more efficient.